This month's Where Did the Road Go is sponsored by Allison Cook and Super Inframan. Thank you so very much. And now our show.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Seriah.
Welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? And tonight I am joined by Mr. Chris Ernst. Hey, Chris.
Hello, everybody.
And Joshua Cutchin.
Hello.
Man, this hasn't happened in years. You've been on a number of shows in fairly frequent order here.
I've got a new lease on life. I'm making a concerted effort, so just you can continue to thank me as we go through the interview.
So this is going to sort of be a Wandering the Road episode, I think, but we're going to start with something you say I suggested that I didn't remember suggesting, but that doesn't mean I didn't suggest it.
I hope that there's some very diligent listener who has their Patreon segment, and it's like, yes, you totally suggested that. I'm
not saying I didn't.
Well, as I recall, at some point we started talking, I believe, on a Patreon segment about researchers whose work is going to age particularly well. You know, we can go a lot of different directions with that. What I started thinking of was like people who are regarded as being a little bit kooky right now, whose work will probably not only age well, but has more merit than people are willing to give it right now.
Sure.
I thought that might be a good point to start from.
Well, I mean, if you go back just a little bit, you got people like Velikovsky, and you know how much his stuff was looked at as being kooky and ridiculous, and a lot of that stuff has been a lot of his predictions and stuff, as Laird Scranton has shown in his book on the Velikovsky heresies. Science supports a lot of what Velikovsky predicted. He was more right than wrong, and science at the same time was more wrong than right.
Yeah, that's someone that I think is a sort of a prime example of what we're talking about, who I think that if you look at sort of the way that the electric universe stuff has aged, it just seems like there's more momentum behind it as time goes along. And I think I'm speaking for you when I say that I haven't seen anything that's a real strong argument against it. Now, of course, I'm sure that some people have an axe to grind with it, and that's fine. It's not necessarily my ballywick, but it does seem to be aging like a fine wine.
Well, that and more, the accepted science is finding electrical stuff. And they kind of try to work around acknowledging that. You know, it's almost like we don't want to acknowledge the electric universe theory, so we're going to try and kind of couch it in different terms.
Right.
Like we found these huge structures in space, and it's like, oh, you mean the structures the electric universe people have been predicting you were going to find? Those structures, you know?
Yeah. A rose by any other name would smell as sweet.
Because they're electrical structures. So, I mean, you know. But
and even the concept, and even the ether concept or an etheric concept, while maybe not the fluid that was proposed way back in the day, we're getting closer. I mean, particularly, I had noted down the electric universe as one of the ones to kind of bring up for this particular subject, and I think that this idea of some substance, even if we're talking at the subquantum level, is increasingly becoming something that people are, at least I have seen in sort of reading, casually reading some articles. Again, this is not my bailiwick either, and I'm certainly not going to try to explain brain theory like I did one time. But I do think that, that at least the idea of there being some sort of, non-vacuum or a vacuum substance that exists in terms of connecting different parts of the universe, very much within the model of the electric universe. Yeah. People keep coming back to that, especially when you see things like string theory and dark matter start to kind of dissolve under scrutiny.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, and you can draw a line from etheric concepts to Wilhelm Reich's orgone energy, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Which again is not a strong suit of mine, but I've always found really interesting and has a certain degree of parsimony to it.
Well, right, and there is something that's being held up in terms of this idea of there being I don't know if there's a word for it yet that we can actually use, Akashic record or something. But if you take a book like Braden's newest book, Real Magic, I mean that's kind of what he's motioning towards, is there being some sort of space where this information is exchanged, coming from a space of pure information. And again, I think Braden maybe isn't somebody that's necessarily going to age as well once you get beyond the kind of base theories and principles, because it seems to get into something a bit more commercial. But I do think that, you're seeing some sort of proof, or at least research that is supporting further theories and hypotheses.
Yes.
Yeah, I do think that Braden is a good spokesperson for this stuff.
Yeah.
As well, I mean, when you look at the way science has treated some of the stuff that they accept today, I mean, you look at the people who the guy who first came up with the tectonic plate theory in the early 1900s, he was made a laughingstock and blackballed from science. And then a few decades later, someone else comes up with it and they accept it. There's always that resistance against, the established ideas. And I think today you see that in stuff like dark matter, especially. There's literally no evidence that dark matter exists in any way, shape, or form, but yet they keep pursuing it, keep coming up with new things that continue to disprove it, and then find more reasons why, no, it must exist because this is the thing we need for all these other theories to work. And instead of taking it from a true science aspect and saying, well, maybe we're just wrong, they're trying to squeeze that in there somewhere.
Well, and similarly, some things that we accept that seem patently obvious, like the idea of Pangea. I mean, if you look at it, it all sort of fits together like a little map,
right,
like a little puzzle rather, on the map. That was also regarded as skepticism as well.
Well, that was the original tectonic plate theory. He said, look, all these continents kind of fall in, fit together like a puzzle. And they said, you're crazy, you're done, that's heresy. Meteors, rocks don't fall from the sky. Late 1800s, Ford always talked about this. They would say, no, some stupid farmer just saw lightning hit a magnetic rock on the ground, and they're too stupid to realize rocks don't fall from the sky.
Yeah, I definitely vote to retire the idea of a stupid person doesn't know what they saw as a means of explaining away anomalies, because talk about something that hasn't aged well, especially when you apply that to broad swaths of indigenous people. Like, that sure as heck has not aged well.
Absolutely. I mean, it's easy for us to take our paradigm and look down on anyone who doesn't share it. It's almost a sense of insecurity. Because if our paradigm did work perfectly, then what do we care? We can prove it, but we can't prove it.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's sort of a tired argument, but it's amazing how many people will say, in one breath, how many times science has thought as an establishment, or I should say the establishment, has thought that it has all the mysteries of the world cataloged and measured.
Right.
And then say, no, but we're there now. They just weren't there then.
Right.
It's like, really? I mean, there was a time in the 19th century where it was discouraged to go into the scientific field. Like, you didn't want your kids to go into the sciences because, like, oh, they're almost done cataloging everything.
Yeah.
Which is just one of the most laughable, just one of the most laughable positions you could have today.
That and when you look at especially early scientific stuff in the 1900s and stuff, when they started finding evidence of a worldwide flood, they covered it up because they didn't want to support the biblical narrative. The last thing they wanted are the headlines to say science proves the Bible, which is probably much the same reason that they covered up existence of things like giants. Because again, you're looking at biblical stories about giants and they're going, those didn't exist. oh, wait, we found a giant skeleton. Let's just put that over in cubbyhole B3 and never go there again.
Yeah, I mean, the more you look into those stories, the more maddening it gets. And I know you just had Randall on, and he's definitely somebody who I think is going to. I think we've talked about it before, Seriah. I mean, there's going to come a day when a lot of his stuff is literally in textbooks. Like, I just think that's a done deal at this point.
I think he's getting there now.
Yeah.
I mean, more and more people are accepting that we were hit by some kind of extraterrestrial object at the, during the Ice Age.
Yeah, it's been
so
interesting
funny
to track that. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
I was just going to say, it's so funny how recalcitrant some people are to admit that happened. I'm just thinking, when that seems to be, for the longest time, at least when we were growing up, that was the theory of what killed the dinosaurs. But no, that could never happen again. We could never have another meteor again.
And it turns out that the meteor may not have completely killed off the dinosaurs.
Right, which is the other thing. Yeah.
Like, the more we learn, the more we learn how wrong we were.
Although I will say, I was just thinking about this the other day, and I've always been, as a monster kid, into cryptozoology and stuff like Machiavellian Bembe and some of the other relic dinosaurs that supposedly exist. And I thought to myself, isn't it interesting how none of those, or sorry, not none, but very few of these dinosaur sightings have the dinosaurs with feathers, and that's all that paleontologists are talking about now, is how dinosaurs, almost all theropods at least, had feathers.
Right.
I find that really interesting. From a co-creative standpoint, I find that really interesting.
Yeah. We've even been moving further and further away from that. I mean, that was when I was really into the Loch Ness Monster as a kid in the 80s, that was, the predominant scientific theory was that somehow this was some plesiosaur that had been locked into the lake. And at this point now, I mean, most scientific studies have said, we're pretty sure that's not the case. With the sensing data that they have, and maybe I'm wrong. I mean, I am not the cryptozoologist, so if there is something else, I'd be curious to know.
There are still some people who are banging the drum that champ in Lake Champlain is a Tanystropheus, which would be a sort of a long-necked, dinosaur reptile from the Triassic period that would walk along the seabed, and its head would actually sort of be up towards the top of the water surface level. But I have a little bit more patience with that than I do with the Nessie thing, because there's just so much occult weirdness around Loch Ness, and you've got that rich, Kelpie tradition and water horse tradition that ties into fairy folklore. I just
house, come out.
Yeah, I just don't see that happening. I'd be much more open to the idea of a long-necked pinniped, which is what I think it was. I believe it was Bernard Heuvelmans or Ivan T. Sanderson, I don't remember which, proposed that as a possibility.
Right.
Which I'm much more sympathetic to that idea. But or ghost dinosaur. Like I'm all about ghost
dinosaur. Too few people go to the ghost dinosaur. I mean, hey. You really think it's just going to be human ghosts? Come on. I'm being very serious, too.
Yeah,
I know. I'm being serious, too. I mean, this is sort of F.W. Holiday territory that we're getting into.
Right?
But, yeah, I love that idea. That kind of ties into an idea that I'm working on of just everything being a giant ghost story anyway. But speaking of Randall, Graham Hancock is another person who I think has done a lot of great work. That I think continues to this is your drinking game, folks. Every time we say age well, take a shot. But I think is going to continue to age well.
Well, the thing about Graham is that there were some things that Graham, when he did his first book, he came back and he said, I was wrong with this and I was wrong with that. But he stuck to his guns on a number of things, and a number of those things have proven to be true. The one that stands out to me is that he was talking about the Indian subcontinent there, like the southern part of India by what is it, Madagascar? No, what's the island, big island?
Sri Lanka.
Yes,
Sri Lanka.
So I believe it's between there. There are supposed to be a bunch of temples.
Rama's Bridge, the bridge between maybe you're thinking of something different.
Well, there was supposed to be a bunch of temples, and each one would be inundated, and they'd build a new temple. And he said something like there were 7 or 9 temples or something, and only the last one was above water. And of course, the academics said, "You're crazy. That's just these crazy religious people saying this. And when that tsunami hit back in the early 2000s, it uncovered one of the temples.
Right.
And nowhere in there do you see Graham Hancock getting a mention that, hey, Graham Hancock mentioned this in Underworld,
In Underworld, yeah.
Yep.
It's like, oh, look what we found. It's like, yeah, just what Graham was telling you would find.
Right. Well, they're not going to give. I mean, by they, I mean, the scientific establishment.
No, they're not.
In the industry of science, they're not going to give credit to those outsiders.
And even Robert Schoch with his work on the Sphinx. Robert and John Anthony West. It's going to be a long time before you see that in actual academic books, despite the fact that the geology is sound. That's water damage. There's no geologist who will argue that what you're seeing on the Sphinx is rain erosion.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this alternative history stuff, I mean, it kind of feels fashionable to champion it because it's contrarian, but I think so much of it is just so logically based. And the more we look at, especially in terms of the stuff that we talk about on the Where Did the Road Go, the more it seems like that's a likely possibility. I mean, what I really like about comparing beliefs from cultures that are separated in time and space, at incredible lengths, like, comparing certain Native American beliefs and ancient Sumerian beliefs or something, cultures that should have no contact with each other, you sort of back the establishment into a corner where they have to acknowledge one of three things. Either that these things have an objective truth, aliens and fairies and ghosts and all this stuff, or that the collective unconscious is something that has a real physicality to it and is a lot more powerful than we give it credit, or that there was indeed a global civilization in antiquity. So you basically back the establishment into a corner where they have to acknowledge one of those three things is the most parsimonious answer.
Right.
There was a part in one of David Hatcher Childress's Lost Cities books. And those are filled with a lot of crazy speculation and stuff. They're fun reads. He seems to kind of tell you what's going on and then give you his speculation on it, which I think is cool. But he talked about being in a museum or a temple in Central America, and he's looking at the designs and all this other stuff. He's like, I've been in temples and museums in China that have almost this exact stuff. Mm-hmm. And he said something. He's like, if I woke up here not knowing where I was, I would probably have told you I was in China just from looking at this stuff. And he said something to the tour guide or whoever was doing it and said that to them. And they said, well, there's no link between China and here. And he's like, how can you say that? And they're like, because there isn't.
Right.
They have no proof that there isn't. And it would suggest that there was, but, one of the other people said something to him like, well, I don't study that stuff, so it's not important to me.
Yeah.
They don't study the Chinese mythology and ancient culture, so it has no place being studied in Central America or South America.
Yeah, as much as I have mixed feelings about the internet and about some of the hits that higher education is taking in the era of COVID and the era of people being autodidacts, at least people have the the opportunity to become autodidacts, and I think with that comes a greater dissemination of this evidence and this knowledge, taking the good with the bad. There's a lot of garbage out there too. Yeah.
The other part I found amusing in one of his books is where there was a lava flow that went through an old temple in Central America. And the tour guide was talking about the temple and saying it was built in 500 AD, and then mentioned the lava flow dated to something like 1100 BC. And he went, wait, the lava flow that is older than the temple? And she's like, yeah. He's like, how is the lava flow that's going through the temple older than the temple?
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember seeing at one point there was a picture of, I guess they had used pigment samples on, and this is where I'm probably going to screw up. It was either an Aztec or a Mayan temple, and I know there are very different cultures there, but it was one of the sort of ancient cultures of Central or South America forget which, but they had painted it the colors they thought it actually was, because of course there's no colors on these anymore. They've all worn off, and it was really amazing how like when I first saw it, I thought I was looking at a contemporary like Thai or Southeast Asian temple or pagoda. It was really like striking how the color brought it into this place that was very, very similar to a lot of what you see in terms of these really ornate, like Angkor Wat style extant temples that exist in Southeast Asia now that are all very colorful. I remember being pretty surprised at that, just talking about visual proof of something that you see before your eyes. Yeah. That was pretty interesting.
And you see that a lot across the world. You see so many similarities in these ancient cultures that it's impossible to say that they all just came up with the same thing in every single culture. And I always loved the argument, like, people would initially, years and years ago, people would say, well, there's pyramids in Egypt and in, Central and South America. And the scientists would say, yeah, but the pyramids in Egypt were used as tombs and the ones in South America were not. Except that's not true. Some of the ones in South America and Central America are tombs, and most of the ones in Egypt aren't.
Yep.
So, I mean, the arguments against this stuff are just stupid a lot of times.
Yep.
So who else do you have on your list, Josh?
Controversial one. I don't necessarily care for the way that he interviews people because he can be a little bit combative and tends to step on people's verbal toes a little bit. But I mentioned this in Slack with Chris. Richard C. Hoagland.
Yep.
I think that a lot of what he says is a little bit out there for my taste, but at the same time, I think that some of his stuff, especially pertaining to structures on
Mars.
Yeah, on Mars. I think there's some good stuff there that I think we're slowly inching towards, loath as I am to endorse the extraterrestrial hypothesis for UFOs. I think we are slowly inching towards confirmation that there was something complex in terms of life on Mars at some point in the past. And I think people like him and, was it John Brandenburg, who talks about the, was it Xenon 95 gas?
Yeah.
On Mars. I think that both those guys, I think that it's going to have staying power, some of the stuff that they've talked about.
Yeah, I think with him, Hoagland, I loved Hoagland's stuff at first. And over time, he sort of got to the point where everything was artificial. And it's like, okay, I think you're caught on this. I'm just throwing the artificial, overlay on everything in the solar system. And it's like, okay, you were good with the Mars stuff,
Yeah.
There's definitely
even with the Mars stuff, I think he went a little too I feel like he's one of those people, like I said in the Slack, where the shape of his idea is sort of right, if not the specifics.
Yeah,
because he really does go way too far into the specifics of what he thinks was sort of happening there, and what he thinks was it. But absolutely, I mean, like the initial shape of how he sort of the analysis of these things that were discovered when they were discovered. Yeah, I mean, I think it still holds up.
That's a great way to put it. And just to clarify, the Brandenburg stuff was Xenon 129. I had my isotope ratio wrong.
And as far as we know, the only way that is produced is through nuclear weapons.
Right. It's this. Yeah.
That doesn't mean it's the only way it's produced, but it's the only way we know of that it's produced.
Right. I mean, for all we know, I think you might have floated this idea to me at one point, Seriah. It could be a byproduct of something about some sort of mechanism related to the electric universe that we haven't, figured out or accepted.
Velikovsky's idea is that Venus made a very close approach to Mars and basically destroyed the planet with these thunderbolts of plasma that exchanged between the planets. When I had
thunderbolts and lightning, very frightening.
When I had Walt Thornhill on, I had actually said to him, I said, so let's say there was a civilization on Mars when this happened. What would we see remaining of it? And he basically said nothing. It would have ripped part of the planet out. It may have created the asteroid belt. It almost certainly created the moons, and it ripped away the atmosphere.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
So we might see things like the pyramids still standing.
Or the face.
Right. And the face is one of those things that NASA, I mean, I don't know. I don't understand the logic. Like, if you see something that even has a millionth of a chance of being artificial, why would you not go right for it? Like, it's a face. It's probably natural, but we should check it out just in case. Instead, NASA's like, we're definitely not checking it out.
I really think that there is a huge contingent of what would basically be like the family Collins elite that over the course since like World War II have been stopping the flow of information because of its anti-Christian implications. Well, that's something that I think is we kind of underestimate that. Some people do.
Well, that's a through line through a lot of this stuff, though. I mean, it was long rumored that Jimmy Stewart bought the original Minnesota Iceman because he was afraid that it would somehow conflict with his Christian views on, the Book of Genesis and the origin of man.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Because if you think about the shift too that sort of happened, I mean, there are recorded accounts of this. I mean, I think Pat Price is on record talking about. Essentially, like this being one of the reasons why there is the dissolution of at least one part of the remote viewing program. But it's slowly been creeping in there, and you can see this kind of like if you think about I guess the suppression of information and weirdness such as UFOs or space. There's this sort of like one goes up and the other goes down as you get more of these sort of fundamentalists, I think, in office post World War II. I haven't charted that or anything, but it's in the back of my mind as a trend. Because if you think about it, I mean, a lot of this started out like it was, we had government inquiry into UFOs. We had, at least there was some amount of like engagement with it, even if it was being done at sort of the MK Ultra level.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, you have the one side where science is trying to not support anything in the Bible. And then you have the other side who are trying to make sure anything that doesn't support the Bible gets suppressed.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's just speculation, but I think like whenever we go into things like this sort of suppression of information that goes against a particular cosmology, that to me, it seems to be like it make the most sense, particularly with the evidence that we do have for there being this sort of like, a cabal, if not, a loose organization of, fundamentalists within the United States government.
Yeah.
Well, if you can look at things that put either large sums of money at stake or things that strike at the core of someone's identity at stake, then it's pretty easy to extrapolate from that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And the thing is, like, NASA did eventually rephotograph Cydonia in high definition, but the problem is they did it at such an angle, and with the sun at such an angle. I mean, Hoagland analyzed all this stuff, and they, instead of shooting it straight down when it was lit the best, they literally shot it at the worst possible way they could. Then they refused to release the raw footage. They ran a ton of filters over it. And Hoagland took the exact same filters and ran them over a human face, and the face was unrecognizable by the time it was done.
Yeah.
And he's like, so why won't they release the raw footage? If they're not hiding anything, why won't they just give us the raw image? Why do they have to release it with all these filters on it?
Right. Well, I think the number of people that don't realize that a lot of those space photographs are not the unadulterated, first initial product, I think it's pretty striking. I mean, I didn't realize that for a long time in terms of colorization, in terms of the way that they have to stitch things together. Yeah. It's not an indictment necessarily, and it's not to say that you can't believe that space isn't real, or that the world, or that you should believe that the world is flat. But it does leave just a little bit of wiggle room for people to make the case that we're not being presented, the full unvarnished truth.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Like one of the things they did for a long time is they made Mars look way redder in pictures than it actually was.
Right.
So, there was something else Hoagland was talking about that was interesting. Oh, I mean, Hoagland kind of shows you too how and I'm sure this started with whatchamacallit from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, but so much of the occult symbols that are in the whole space program. Like there's enough of them there where you're going, okay, even if he's stretching at times, there's definitely something here.
Well,
you mean starting with Jack Parsons?
Parsons, that's who I was trying to think of. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, and this is a great segue to someone who has a special place in my heart, who I think a lot of people kind of think is kooky, and I'm not saying that he isn't, but he does not get nearly enough attention, I don't think, in the circles that I follow in, and that's Christopher Knowles over at the Secret Sun blog. I've been a long-time follower of... I'm sorry?
I'm not that familiar with him.
He's big into synchromysticism. Okay. He talks about a lot of these sort of NASA naming conventions and just sort of the commercialization of space and sort of this idea that space is an altar. He's been on a jag recently for the past couple of years that when I explain it, it sounds absolutely crazy, but he presents a lot of really interesting circumstantial evidence that makes me go, maybe there's something to what he's saying. A lot of what he's going down is that there were some shenanigans in Elizabeth Fraser's past that have basically led to her being a spiritually possessed siren who predicts and or influences a lot of national world events. And I know that sounds crazy.
Yeah, Elizabeth Fraser of the Cocteau Twins, by the way.
Okay.
He calls her the Sybil. Yes. I'm quite familiar with Christopher Knowles' stuff too.
Okay, so you understand where I'm coming from, then, Chris, right? Because it's like it's super compelling, but sometimes it's just like, where are we going with this? But,
I mean, there's some. He had some really great, sort of insights into the Nine as well. The Nine is in like Puharik. And the seance that, which is it's pretty cool. Yeah, I mean, I don't say that I agree with everything that he says. There's some sort of like weird kind of anti-woke, anti-trans stuff that I've found in some of his blogs recently that kind of weirds me out. And maybe it's just the crowd that he's like been attracting, but I don't know. I found it to be a little like it's been hard for me to absorb some of the other stuff that I think is very cool that he does. Where there's this weird, it's almost like I feel like there's like this weird dog whistling to like, Pizzagate folks or something like that. But again, like you're right. Some of this other stuff that he talks about in terms of like space as an altar, and a lot of the NASA missions and these different rocket launches having some sort of occult ceremonial significance is very strong. I mean, the arguments that he puts forth for the symbolism that's inherent in some of these things, like the Osiris Rex launch, why are they naming it this? Why are they doing it on these particular dates with these particular, planetary alignments and stuff like that? Somebody's got to know.
I think Hoagland's the one that initially put an eye on all of that, though. And then he did that book with, I forget who he did it with, called like Dark NASA or whatever, where he talks about all that stuff.
Who is this?
Hoagland.
Oh, Hoagland. Back to Hoagland.
Yeah, well, I mean, because that's what the stuff that Hoagland's talking about is all these occult things.
Right. So that's we get the two of them in a room together and they end up talking over each other quite a bit because they're
I think I remember hearing they've done a couple interviews together where they really I think if I remember correctly
Dark Mission is the name of the book I was thinking of.
Chris talks to Hoagland from time to time, and it's always an interesting romp, but he's really good at finding these things that again, it toes this line between complete coincidence and something that might actually have some significance. For example, he noted that Ghislaine Maxwell was arrested in the middle of a bunch of UFO hotspots on World UFO Day, and that her sister's father-in-law was actually best buds with Jack Parsons.
In New Hampshire, I want to say like no more than 30 minutes away from where Crowley was when he was in New Hampshire.
Yep.
Yeah.
So he points out stuff like that, and you look at it, and it's almost like the gestalt feels more significant than any of the individual things. And you're like, well, I just, I don't know what to make of it, but I find it super interesting, and I devour
it. Excellent way of putting it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I can't say whether or not he's on anything, but I always find it really, really interesting because it's one of those things where you're like, if he's right, then holy cow, what the heck is going on with this world?
Yeah. And the book Dark Mission: The Secret History of NASA is Richard Hoagland and Mike Barra. Mike Barra deals with a lot of artificial stuff on the moon.
I don't know if I am too familiar with his stuff.
I've heard him a bunch of times on Coast to Coast. I actually wrote him once early on trying to get him on the show, and he never responded to me. Like, he was kind of one of those, I wouldn't mind talking to him, and then he didn't respond, and I went, all right, whatever. But, I mean, his interviews on Coast to Coast, they were one of those things where he'd talk about stuff, you'd be like, oh, that's interesting. And now I think you're going too far. But the other stuff was interesting.
Yeah, I think that's sort of maybe a running well, not with everybody that we've talked about, because I don't think that's really the case with Graham or Randall or some of those folks. But maybe that is, as we shift towards the latter half of this conversation, that's sort of a recurring theme that you'll see. It's like, I don't know about all this, but there's something there that I think some of these people are getting at.
I mean, and there's definitely something weird about the moon. I did a partial conversation with Randall on that for Patreons. And he only touches, I think he said he went through about 4 slides that he has prepared of 127 of the weird things about the moon. I mean, the moon is just such a bizarre thing that we have no explanation of how it's even there.
Well, we're sort of getting into a sort of Giza Death Star territory, right? Wasn't that Joseph Farrell's sort of bailiwick?
Joseph Farrell's, yeah. My favorite moon thing is it has to still be Ingo Swann's alleged RVing of the moon in Penetration.
Oh God, I love that story.
Yeah,
I love that story so much.
And what happened when he RV'd the moon?
Well, he essentially saw. Correct me if I'm wrong, Josh, but I feel like he saw that there, like in these craters on the remote side of the moon, there were essentially like these naked humanoids that were building something, correct?
I actually have it at hand.
Oh, good. There you go.
He was doing some remote viewing, and he was initially frustrated, but he apparently was given these coordinates that were on the far side of the moon, and he started seeing things that he just knew couldn't be on the moon because it was like this mining operation.
Right. Yeah, the mining operation, yeah.
And he said there were nets over craters, houses in which someone obviously lived, except that I couldn't see who, save in one case. In that case, I saw some kind of people busy at work on something I could not figure out. The place was dark. The air, he has a lot of inverted commas in this, so the air was filled with a fine dust, and there was some kind of illumination, like a dark lime green fog or mist. The thing about them was that they either were human or looked exactly like us, but they were all males, as I could see well, since they were all butt-ass naked. Sorry.
Right. Of course, that's the thing I remember is naked people.
Right. This is my favorite part is here towards the end, though. I had absolutely no idea why. They seemed to be digging into a hillside or a cliff. But there in my psychic state, as I felt I was, some of the guys started talking excitedly and gesticulating. 2 of them pointed in my direction. I think they've spotted me, Axel, he said to his handler. They were pointing at me, I think. How could they do that unless they have some kind of high psychic perceptions too? And I love that idea because that to me opens up the idea that, maybe some UFO phenomena, and the reason that certain people see UFOs more than others are that these people are actually able to view other civilizations remote viewing Earth. Like, I love that idea. What if he's actually what if he's experiencing what, other civilizations experience when they come to Earth and we see them as UFOs?
And then there's a later scene in the book too, where doesn't he see, like, he's in a shopping mall and he sees this woman that's like he describes her as being like really bodacious, but he gets this weird vibe that she's like not human, and he starts to approach her and he gets like tackled by his handlers, and they're like, no, don't go near her, she'll find out you're psychic. She's one of like the infiltrators, they're these psychic beings that are here on Earth. Did you remember that scene that I'm talking about?
I believe that's the case. There is a lot of interesting sexual subtext in that whole book. I mean, the thing's called penetration, so it's
yes, it is. Yeah,
there in the text. Yeah.
There's a significant sexual subtext to most of Ingo Swann's things. I mean, like in the open too. Like he was very open about it. His art. He's very he was an erotic man.
I would like to point out too that when Jane Roberts Seth was asked what UFOs were, he said it was consciousness from other realities, and he was kind of surprised we could see them.
Interesting.
And this was at least 1971 when that was said. So way before ideas like that were floating around generally. I think maybe Keel had said it prior to that, and I'm not even sure of that.
Right.
So now we look at this stuff as maybe it's other consciousnesses, and it's like, well...
Right. Well, it was Keel to and then probably the most recent, or at least for me, the most recent person in terms of influencing me for ETH would be the late Mac Tunney's, or when I read that stuff in the 90s, at least that was, for me very, I think that's when it came out, late 90s. The Cryptoterrestrial, continuing along that sort of Keel bent, though I think, if I remember Tunney's, he was thinking of it more in terms of like underground, Darrow type, was some of the supposition there that he was making.
Mm-hmm.
And we know from Josh's most recent book that there's a lot of stuff going on underground.
Yeah. And I think that I'll defer to someone with a lot more insight like Patrick Harper as to why that might be. And what I love about the way that he frames it is that, from a Jungian perspective, it completely makes sense that we would place the origin of these things underground in caverns under the surface of the water in the case of lake monsters and river monsters, because it's symbolic of the subconscious and the id.
Yeah.
Which, I was having a conversation with somebody about that earlier today, and I think that, I feel like I speak about those sort of things in these circles, and if people aren't on board with it, they're like, well, that's just a bunch of mumbo-jumbo. And I'm like, no, it's actually really super cool if you really think about the idea that these other intelligences are trying to speak to us through theater and trying to speak to us through symbolism. I think that's really super compelling for me, at least.
Well, you need a common language.
Yeah. I mean, I think that Sapir-Whorf hypothesis has been pretty much discarded, but I think that there's still some value in that thought.
The what hypothesis?
The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the idea that, your language actually literally sort of shapes the way that you perceive reality. I think that that's sort of fallen out of vogue with academics, but I still think that there's a lot of validity to that concept.
Oh, so do I. Yeah, I mean, perception is... Again, I recommend everyone read The Invisible Gorilla if you want to really just break your brain on how we perceive things.
Yep.
It's an astounding piece of work, and it shows how little we actually perceive of our own world and how much it's colored by our expectations and emotions. So, any other names on your list, Josh?
Well, just to cast a broad blanket category here too, I'm just going to say magicians, practicing magically operant magicians. I mean, I've said for a while that at one point, like in, I don't know, undergrad or grad school, I used to think that the smartest person in the room, in terms of being on point and being well read and whatnot, was usually the atheist. And now, as I've gotten older, the smartest person in the room that I encounter is usually the magically operant person in terms of being really well rounded and well read in a lot of different things.
Well, they may be equally well read, but the person who is practicing magic realizes there's something more to the world than materialism.
Well, and they're and just more open minded to different things working. And I say this as neither an atheist nor a magically fluent person, but yeah.
And the thing about magic is it's something that in our culture has been misconstrued as something that it's not. It's a subtle changing of reality or shifting of reality to your will. Whereas, popular fiction and movies and stuff act like it's almost a materialistic system. And that's not what it is.
Yeah.
Well, once you start framing things in, people's minds about, once you start recontextualizing magic as operating or making your will manifest in the world in an act as simple as you've cited before, an act as simple as like picking up a cup, and that's making your will, your mind, something in your mind manifest in reality.
That was Crowley's example.
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense.
And the thing is,
a lot more sense.
If you understand, with psychic research and psi research, we know that there is some power our brain has over the actual universe. The Pear Laboratories did those tests with the balls dropping down, and hundreds of these balls would drop down into this machine, and if no one paid attention to it, it would eventually form a perfect bell curve. But if someone sat there and focused on more of the balls landing on the right or the left while they were falling, you would find that more of the balls would end up on that side of the bell curve.
Well, yeah, it's one of those things where people need to realize that statistical significance doesn't mean that it's going to work, 98% of the time.
No.
Right.
And if you can just nudge, this is something that Gordon White, somebody else who I think is going to continue into the future with having some really insightful things to say. Something that he really helped me realize too was that just even if you have a 1 in a million chance of winning the lottery and you shrink it down to 1 in 100,000, the odds are you probably still aren't going to win the lottery, but you still have shrunken those odds with some sort of magical practice. So that's the thing that you always can use as a retort when people say, why don't more psychics win the lottery? It's not about ensuring something happens. It's about sort of gaming the system and trying to decrease the number of odds against you.
Well, here's the other thing. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I was just going to say, and I think the thing too about, I agree. I think some of Gordon White's stuff's probably going to age well. I'm a little suspicious of sort of the, materialism of, or his focus, I guess, on like wealth to some degree. I feel like there ends up, I do think that there is a division that some people are a little bit loath to get into in terms of materialism, but like the, I guess what you are using this concentration of will to sort of affect and impact. So, trying to push things in these sort of little directions to get kind of a material return upon your will, I guess. I feel like that as a practice, while it does, I think, work, I feel like there's a different, almost, let's see, I don't want to say spiritual tact to utilizing magic or using will that still is, I want to say it can't be popular at this point because there's kind of no way, unless you're trying to monetize it in sort of a new age self-help way. I feel like there ends up becoming like a problem there when you're kind of trying to use this expression of will as a way to change your space in the material world. I think that, I don't know. I just, I think in terms of like how people look at magic or operating magicians, I do still feel like there is this division between people who are basically trying to use it as like a reality hack. And again, I'm not making a judgment. It's just, for me, I'm a little more uncomfortable with that. This idea of magic as a hacking of reality, where you're able to sort of influence things to gain more. I feel like there's this other track of magic, the one that has more to do with sort of self-exploration, spirituality, and stuff like that, that I would imagine as the years kind of go further and further will be not considered correct, but maybe the more natural flow that things go with magic. And I know I'm being very kind of nebulous in the way that I'm talking about this, but I just wanted to kind of put it in there because I do see different trends in the way that people are dealing with being operant magicians. And I think it's interesting to look at, or it's something that's worth taking a look at.
No, I think that's a really, really interesting angle to take on it.
Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I think that as much as people will say that there isn't some sort of blowback or some sort of barrier to using magic to make a lot of money, I kind of think that there still is in terms of material wealth. I do think you're right in that respect. But again, I'm not the most magically fluent person in the world, so
right, and I'm not either. So yeah.
So here's the thing with that: like, there is so much of us that we are not conscious of. And more than just the subconscious. One of the Patreon segments we did recently, I think it was the one with the Snake Brothers, we talked about Colin Wilson's idea of the robot, and how our body sort of just does all this stuff automatically. And, the more routine we are, the more the stuff is just done for us. We're not really conscious of it. And then you look at the subconscious, you look at dreams, you look at all this other stuff. And then you look at the ideas of like a true self, a higher self. That was Crowley's thing, was contact with that higher self. Do as thou wilt should be the whole of the law, was to find your higher self and follow that path that your higher self wanted you to be on. That's what that really means. It's been corrupted so much, but that was what he was trying to say. But we're not that higher self. It's part of us, but it's not consciously accessible. So I think when you're doing magic, if it is not in line with what your higher self truly wants, it's not going to work. We face challenges because we need to face challenges. And if we just remove them all with magic, well, that's not really helpful to us.
I like that way of putting it, Seriah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's something I'm realizing through a lot of stuff I'm going through lately. Is just the value of the alchemical process and how applicable that can be to your lifestyle.
Yeah.
And how this idea of personal transformation and refinement through stress and through hardship is one of the most powerful archetypes that we can aspire to, and how you've got these concepts of the dry way and the wet way being ways to attain this way through either, fast and dangerous or slow and methodical. I think there's a lot of value to that I didn't really realize until recently. So, maybe if I ever get a spare moment, I'll actually do some more research into that, because I've written about it a little bit, but yeah.
Yeah, and that's, so when you're using magic just to make money, just to bring money. I mean, maybe in certain situations that's in line with what your higher self needs. But I think if it's not, it's just not going to work for you. That's why you can't just use magic to win the lottery, because chances are, if you needed to win the lottery, you would have won the lottery.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you're right.
So it's the most effective magic is the magic that's in accordance with your true self, with your true will. And finding out what that is not so easy.
Yeah.
We may be 1% of what we are as an entire being. Our conscious mind, those of us sitting here talking or listening to this, that may be just 1% of who we are. But we don't know that other percent. It's like we're cut off from it. We get inklings of it here and there, but who knows how much more is out there?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a place that I would agree, especially with my particular upbringing and sort of the set of weird cosmology that I have. That's this strange mix of like proto-Sufism and Advaita Vedanta and Zoroastrianism. I think there's, but having that kind of background, which is in many ways kind of a smorgasbord of like Eastern philosophies, there really is this fundamental, underpinning to a lot of the non-Western ways of thought, and I would say even an underpinning to sort of, mystical Christianity that starts from the point where, we have these other bodies, these other parts of our quote unquote, and I'm using air quotes here, body, ourselves that, we are not conscious of. Be that the soul, the subtle body, the mental body, the diamond body. There are many different, names for it. And it's something that exists and that we are interacting with on a daily basis, and we have this body that's kind of interacting with a world we can't see. There's these all these worlds that exist, beyond our conscious sight, and I say sight again in quotes, our understanding and consciousness that we are, functioning and existing in. But it's like I'm trying to think of a good analogy for it. It's almost like you have this connected puppet body that is doing things in another space that's following yours exactly, kind of like an avatar in a video game, right. But we're just not conscious of that body. And a lot of these practices that would exist, yogic practices, or tantric practices, are magic practices, as they were, are to try to give you some modicum of control over that body in the same way that you control the consciousness of this body.
Yeah.
Well, and even, that was a lot of excellent points, and I feel kind of silly saying this, but even, on just the materialist level, they're finally starting to realize the presence of neurons in other parts of the body as well, and idea that perhaps whatever consciousness is, I think totally. we all agree that it's not just an epiphenomena of the brain, but whatever right. Consciousness is not, solely, relegated to the locality of your brain. It's actually throughout your entire body, which right. Explains the newfound affinity of people who received organ transplants to suddenly love chicken nuggets or whatever when they never did. Well, as it turns out, the person that they got the organ from used to love chicken nuts or whatever.
And that's also part of the whole holographic theory of the universe, that every part contains
right.
a whole. So as your organs contain part of who you are, and when it's transported to someone else, that part is also there. I think things are way more complex than people are ever going to be able to break it down from. And that's the thing. Like, science is all about breaking things down to their smallest parts and seeing how they work, and that works with some stuff. But I think when you're dealing with things like consciousness, it doesn't work. That's not something you can just break down and take apart.
Well, and you've also got, that's you'd think that we would realize that at this point, the first law of hermeneutics, as above, so below. It's patently obvious to anybody who looks at anything, the veins on a leaf looking like the structure of the tree as a whole, or any number of things that are fractal in nature. But for some reason, we just don't quite grasp that in every aspect of life. But I think really every aspect of life that really does hold true is the case more often than not.
Well, and again, I think you're looking at where, like, you have these old adages, these old ideas from alchemy and stuff like that, and modern science views that stuff as an anathema. It's like, we're not going to touch that. Oh, they said as above, so below. No. They're wrong because they were primitive and stupid.
Right. Well, that's that whole idea that somehow empirical knowledge is the only knowledge, that's worthwhile. And we've gained a lot of amazing things from using the scientific method. Sure. And I think we would probably all agree that it's crazy to throw that. You don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Not.
Science is great. Scientific method is great. Let's keep it. I have a really cool phone and I can do all these great things that I, wouldn't be able to do otherwise. But that doesn't mean that there isn't, and entirely other ways of living that could equally give you gains of other types that maybe aren't phones. So trying to find that, and again, it's that idea of primitive people, quote unquote primitive people, because they don't have some particular type of technology, which is what we understand as being advanced somehow, like electronic technology, they weren't advanced, which, as we all know, is something people are reconciling with now. Like, well, yeah, it doesn't have to be ancient aliens. It could just be ancient, really smart people that did things in a different way.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and speaking just to the value of science, I want to sort of make a distinction because it's really easy to get accused of being anti-science or something in a lot of these shows, and that's not the case. No. But at the same time, I think science is great, but I think people need to sort of keep a check on how much credit they give "quote unquote" science as a rule. I mean, it's a toolbox. Yeah. You know what I mean? Yeah. So people are like, well, science gave you airplanes. No, people with ingenuity who use science gave us airplanes. It's still It's still the human idea. It's still that sort of endeavoring and striving towards using science to do things. But it isn't science itself that gave us. It's just as much imagination that gave us a lot of this stuff as it was science.
So here's
a lot of the people that really gave us wonderful things in terms of magic over the past 100 years or something were in many ways using, as Crowley said, wasn't it the approach of science, the aim of religion or something like that? I'm completely misquoting.
No, you got it.
But they're using the scientific method for magical or spiritual purposes, which is kind of great.
Yeah, and that's what Crowley wanted. He wanted to take that sort of scientific approach and treat magic with it to get that sort of goal of religion, of reaching that higher self, but do it through trial and error. And, does this work? Does this not work? What parts of this work? And that's one of the things I appreciated right away about Crowley, because I am a big fan of science. I think the scientific method is extremely valuable. However, as with anything, you have to deal with people, and people have their beliefs and their biases, and especially the system we have in place now rewards you for staying within certain paradigms. There are people who don't want to lose their jobs because they're going to say, dark matter doesn't exist. No, we can't say that. We just got to come up with more ways to look for it. So the only way to keep our funding is to keep looking for ways to look for it rather than coming up with new ideas.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, it's one of these things that it's so easy to get sort of dragged out into this pro-science or anti-science argument, but what the conversation we should really be having is, are people pro-truth or anti-truth? Are they, are they being honest? Are they willing to concede stuff? Are they willing to understand that people from a different point of view might perceive things differently? Right. I think that those are the discussions that we should be having. But and here we are in the Kali Yuga, so it's all up for grabs, I guess.
And the thing is, none of us, not a single one of us, even twins, perceive reality exactly the same way. Because reality is made up of our experiences, our perspectives, our genetics, all this different stuff. The things we noticed, the things we didn't notice, the stuff that we emotionally reacted to, the stuff we, forgot that may have had an impact on us. So everyone has a different interpretation of what's around them. And I find that, so often we just, especially nowadays, it's like everything has become, I'm only going to talk to the people I fully agree with. Well, if you break that down enough, you're never going to talk to anyone because there's no one out there that sees the world exactly like you do.
I mean, yeah, I could not agree more. I mean, just having kindness and understanding. Well, I mean, you're sort of getting to something that's like the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis again, this idea that cultures that don't differentiate between the colors gray and green, you don't really even have a conceptualization of them seeing them differently because they don't have that language. But yeah, I mean, I just think that everybody needs to go through life and realize that, and stop to themselves and say, wait a minute, am I the a-hole today? Is that me?
Well, sometimes it's as much as just, one of the things I'll do when I'll talk to someone and say they bring up politics, and I'll be like, I don't really agree with what they said. And instead of saying that, I'll say, so why do you think that? And sometimes they'll make really good points, and I'll be like, wow, I never thought about it that way. Okay, thank you. I still may not agree with them, but now I understand why they think that.
That's such a good way to engage too these days, when like I feel like the default most people have when someone doesn't agree is like automatically defense offense.
Yeah.
Well, we take the worst of the left and the worst of the right, and then we just smack whoever they have identified with. We just smack that worst and the worst of their tribe onto them. Yeah.
Right.
But I mean, anything. I mean, it was like when I was growing up, my parents would always be like, never talk about politics or religion. I'm like, you can talk about this stuff as long as you're not like trying to force your belief on someone else. People are more than happy to talk about it.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. I'll just be like, why do you believe this? What do you believe? You know, what put you in that state of mind, you know? And it's like, and usually it's really interesting, and it makes them think about it too. You know, it's rarely as bad as most people think it is when they, you know, make assumptions.
Yeah.
You know,
Sorry, go ahead.
And also when you're talking about like, you know, how we perceive things, you were mentioning, you know, people not knowing, you know, not having words for different colors. There's also people who are colorblind versus people who can see more colors than most people. And that happens with every sense. So again, that affects our view of the world and what we experience of it.
Yeah, I mean, it just comes back to you talking about, you know, the invisible gorilla. Perception is such a finicky and fragile thing.
Yeah. And it's the thing is, we know so much about perception, and this is where so many of these political parties, religious leaders, news media, you know, whoever's trying to get you on their side, they know how to manipulate this stuff. You know, they know how to manipulate perception and the type of words that people respond to. And it's very hard to get away from it. It's like we're constantly being exposed to a small amount of mind control from everything from the news to advertisements.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, it's absolutely insidious.
Yeah, it's because it just seems like, oh, that was a simple little thing without you realizing what they actually did, because they distracted your attention away from something else. So, but everything's, you know, creating a narrative. Everything's and it's not necessarily just because the pieces fit together doesn't mean it's true.
But before can I throw in some a few quick Bigfoot names in terms of people whose work is going to age really well?
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah.
Timothy Renner, Joshua Cutchin.
Yeah, whatever. But to that extent, two folks whose work I was not really aware of until Tim and I started writing Where the Footprints End, volumes 1 and 2, are Anne Slayton Alberry, who sort of wrote the proto Where the Footprints End. There's a lot of stuff. The book is called Bigfoot, and it's out of print, but it's from, I believe, memory serves, the 70s, and it's the foundational text for a lot of the stuff that we wrote about. Ron Moorhead, who recorded the Sierra sounds and has been one of the more prominent people who has embraced the weirder aspects of Bigfoot, and finally Tom Powell, who's also a researcher who did books like The Locals that talk about a lot of the stranger aspects of Bigfoot. Obviously my list is a little biased in terms of people who view Bigfoot as having, you know, high strangeness attached to him. But I think the truth of the matter is all the really good cryptozoologists already have pretty good reputations. I mean, Jeff Meldrum has done some outstanding work on examining footprints and really sort of saying that, no, these are actually something that the scientific community can and should look at and should view as, you know, legitimate evidence for the existence of something strange in the woods. And, you know, folks like, you know, Lauren Coleman, who I would include on this, except for the fact that I think he's already pretty well appreciated and regarded as he is.
And the thing, even if they turn out to be wrong on certain things, I mean, we need those steps to get from point A to point B. So, you know, just because someone comes up with an idea and it turns out not to be true, but it may have inspired people to think differently about said thing, you know?
Right. Well, it's I mean, it's kind of like Hoagland and some of these other people that we're talking about, who's like, yeah, the shape of what they're talking about is good, or, you know, it gets people. It's like a kindling for a conversation.
Yeah, and I feel that way definitely, even about the people that I was sort of, trying to criticize. I think that, all of the people, obviously, for, particularly the ones that have some modicum of success, I think that, often it's because they do have really good ideas. It's also hard, when you talk about people sort of in this day and age of, I guess, research and publication, however you want to define that, being online or books or whatever, the amount sort of that's expected of of people to have consistently good ideas. I think there is a lot of pressure. Like I would, and I think you were just talking about this, Seriah, but not everybody's going to have a correct idea all the time. No. And that's okay. Like you can take, I think the thing that we have to try to be able to do, particularly when I say we, just something I would probably suggest to people, because I think that it's a good way to look at the world right now, is to, just not put all your eggs in one basket. Like try to take the good ideas from people when they have them, and if they have bad ideas, that's fine, but it also means they can have a good idea too. You just have to sort of figure out where you draw the line and, come to a consensus after looking at several different ideas. I know this is probably not a novel concept to many of you, and you company included, Seriah and Josh, but this idea of looking at several different viewpoints and coming to your own conclusion based upon a synthesis of those, I don't think we can remind people enough in this day and age to do that.
Yeah. Thank you so much for saying that, Chris. I think that I've always been firmly, this is sort of a little bit different than what you're just talking about, but I've always been firmly in the death of the author camp. There are a lot of problematic people throughout history who have made some great art, from Wagner to Roman Polanski and all sorts of folks like that. And so I think that's really important, and I think that's not something that gets brought up a lot nowadays. But also, more to your point, just people having good ideas and bad ideas, and some people, being able to make some mistakes. Again, as long as we're talking about sort of parsing out this nuance, I'll never forget something that Greg Bishop told me, and I really do agree with it. When Phil Imbrogno's academic credentials were revealed as been falsified, everybody just threw out everything that he ever said. And while I agree with that to a degree, like I'm not going to include anything that he collected in any of my books because of that, he still had some interesting ideas, and his thoughts are still valid, even if, everything that he said wasn't exactly true. Similar with Keel, I think we've all kind of all come around on Keel being like, Keel's truthy. He's not presenting the truth so much as he's truthy, but his ideas are still good, and they still sort of, again, this is the word of the day, I guess, that sort of gestalt. It all comes together as having the shape of being what actually happened.
Yeah.
I was gonna mention something else about that, and now I've forgotten what it was. So yeah.
Sorry.
It was a while back. My brain starts listening to what you guys are saying, and then it completely loses what it wanted to say. There was something about the way we deal with ideas. I almost have it, because it revolved around science and the way science deals with things. One of the things I wanted to mention earlier was the sort of fish in a fishbowl sort of analogy. Like as human beings, we're like this fish in this fishbowl. And I know I've used this before, but like we're in a small room, we can see maybe out a window and out a door, and people come in and they feed us and stuff. And we're trying to base and understand all of reality from being inside that fishbowl.
Yeah.
Like we have no concept of the street outside, the cars that are being driven on the street, the planet, the other planets, the other stars. Like this stuff is so far beyond what we can possibly imagine or conceive of, because all we know is what we can see from our fishbowl.
Yeah.
And we have this constant arrogance of acting like, well, that's all there is. It's like, no. And we find new stuff constantly.
And you could even, extend that fishbowl analogy to sort of our instruments, what we have available in terms of sensing things. I mean, most of, the scientific most of the scientific method is based around the ability, excuse me, to, be able to measure things or in some way, quantify things, which relies upon the technology that they have. And, as I think one of you mentioned earlier, what we thought we knew for certain 100 years ago or 50 years ago or 20 years ago, based upon the ability of our tools of measurement, is vastly different. And so the sort of hubris that we have at each of these stages being like, we got it figured out, guys, is it is indeed a fishbowl.
Well, one thing that blew my mind, and I have a friend who works in the aerospace industry, and he's been more sciencey than I am. But we caught up. He was in my wedding, and we were talking about things, and it's really interesting because it's interesting to see the number of people who are scientists who actually kind of think the way that we do and aren't part of that IFL science crowd. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You've got the IFL science crowd. I'm leaving out some words here, but you've got the IFL science crowd, and then you've got the scientists who are actually like, no, it's a lot more difficult and a lot more loosey goosey than that crowd would want to admit. And one of the things that's always blown my mind is the fact that we don't have any accurate representations, any accurate measurements of any coastline, any shoreline, because it depends on how granular you want to get with the the eddies and the coves and the individual divots. It's always changing, and you can get so granular that theoretically a lot of these shorelines could be infinite. So there's nothing. There's never going to be any map that is equal to what the territory actually is, unless you have a one-to-one recreation.
I think the book Chaos, that was dealing with the ideas of chaos science, starts out with that, explaining the farther you get down, these coastlines become almost infinite in the way that you're moving around each grain of sand where the water is, and then a moment later it's completely different. So it's all perspective. Oh, now I forgot the other thing I was going to say. Damn it.
Tisk, tisk, tisk.
See what you did, Josh.
Yep, that's me.
No, I know what it was. So we were talking at the beginning about the looking at these scientists who were saying that there's no rocks from space. And I think a lot of the things that we believe now that we don't have evidence for, things like dark matter, 50, 100 years from now, people are going to look back and be like, look at those people looking for this stuff, and they couldn't find it, and they just kept looking. They didn't look at any new, different ideas.
Right.
And that's not to say that, the electric universe will be the model then, but it could be something completely different than what we know now.
Well, it's like that old joke about the drunk guy who loses his car keys, and he keeps on looking underneath a street lamp. And somebody's like, well, why do you keep on looking underneath the street lamp? And he goes, well, that's because that's where the light is,
Yeah. and people, all people, we need to believe things. And a lot of people mix up belief with facts and evidence. There are very few facts in science. Almost everything is, it's data, it's interpretation of that data, it's theories. And, when you hear people say things like, well, the science is settled. No, science doesn't settle. That's the thing. There's always going to be something new to interpret out of that data. We will never know everything.
Yeah, it's like science doesn't have laws as much as it has extremely, 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 extremely strong tendencies.
Right, exactly. I'll look at something like evolution and say, yeah, evolution makes sense. It seems like that's probably what's going on, but we don't know everything about evolution by any means. There are all kinds of holes in it, but it's the best thing we got at the moment that makes the most sense.
Right. And you can even, and there are things that are even much more actionable than evolution that haven't been quote unquote proven by the scientific method, but we, have enough of faith and sort of the replicability of those particular, parameters or scenarios that we can do things like have airplanes that work and, electricity that works. But still, we're always finding new things out about, that particular subject that can change the conditions.
And there's always things that, we have, and we know that if you do A, B, and C, then you get D, but we may not know exactly why we get D. but we know it works.
Right. It's like the number of medications that are used for off-label, uses.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There are some medications that you look at where sometimes up to like 90% of their usage is for off-label things. Like these things that are side effects that aren't what the medication is actually supposed to treat are actually so efficacious. That's what they get prescribed for.
Wasn't that the case with with Viagra, that they were trying to it was like a new blood pressure medication?
Yes.
And they're like, oh snap. We can give all these guys massive
erections. Yes.
It's really frustrating because the really thick-skulled science denialism does exist, and it's so strident that, again, it doesn't feel like you can have these conversations without people throwing you in that camp and this is not what we're saying. We're just saying that the way that we all perceive of this is not quite the way that it should be thought of.
Yeah. Science is not an absolute. Science is, as you said, a tool. And it's a good tool. It's a useful tool. The scientific method has proven itself again and again. However, I don't think you're going to find the answers to things like consciousness with the scientific method necessarily.
Yeah, it's not the tool that's at fault. It's the underlying epistemology. That's all, folks. The underlying paradigm. Let's go with that.
Yeah.
The underlying paradigm. That's really the problem that needs to be addressed.
So, and of course, like I said, you're always going to have, people have biases. We all do. It's not, it's a natural part of being human that we develop these biases in our beliefs and in the things that we experience and see in the world. So, when you have, even if you're not, and it's more insidious when you're not aware of it, because you're moving forward on this idea that these things are true because you believe they're true without really realizing that it's just a belief.
Yep. Some of this stuff is so ingrained.
It's like one of the things that you have to do sometimes is look at what you believe and why you believe it, and kind of like knock down those pillars of belief and say, okay, would I put them back together the same way with what I know now? And sometimes you do.
Right.
And sometimes you go, why did I believe that? Why was I doing that? It's just something you got there by building off of other stuff that in the meantime has become less relevant.
Yeah, it's you got to be careful of what you got to be careful to build your house not on a foundation of sand.
Well, but I think it's always sand. It's just, are you going to build it the same way 10 years down the line once you've hit a certain point?
Well, yeah, that's one way to put it. Yeah. Well, maybe coarser sand. You want that real coarse sand? You want that real coarse sand.
The way we put things together, the way our brains analyze things is just that. It's like building a house of cards. And you get to a certain point, and if you look at the bottom of the house, you go, wait a minute, none of that's true anymore. Like, that stuff's not valid anymore. What does that mean for the rest of the tower, But for the most part, people don't examine those foundations. They're base assumptions that are outside our conscious. Again, it's something we don't consciously think about.
I heard something that was sort of chilling to me. Is the idea of a sort of self-referential loop found on a site like Wikipedia. Somebody says something on Wikipedia, and then some minor news outlet, some sort of shoddy news outlet like BuzzFeed or something that doesn't have incredibly high journalistic standards, uses Wikipedia to write an article about that subject. And then when somebody goes back into the original article to put in a citation, they put in the BuzzFeed article that cited the faulty information. So you get this sort of feedback loop of just bad information that was never true to begin with, and that's absolutely chilling.
Man, and there's so many of those sites, so many of those articles will pop up in like various news feeds, and it's like, oh, that sounds interesting. And when you go there, there's no content, there's no real information. You're just like, why'd you even bother with the article? Oh, right, you wanted me to click on it for the ads,
Yep.
And even local stuff. I've seen local radio stations do stuff like that, where they have a news feed on their thing, and it's like, oh, this happened. It's like, oh, and I click on it to get more information, and there's barely more than just the headline. And it's like, this is not news reporting. Like, there's nothing here. There's no information.
Yeah, that the old models. I mean, it's really quite similar to what we saw the music industry go through, where it's like, oh no, music is free now. Okay, let's circle the wagons and try to figure out what the heck we're going to do with our industry. I feel like it's something similar that happened with the news industry. I don't think anybody really realized how much of a hit the internet was going to.
Oh no, I think you're completely right. Yeah.
And so now they're just in this battle for clicks that is just a slow death. It really is a slow death. And I don't know. Yeah, again, we're in the Kali Yuga.
Well,
we're also out of time. So thank you, Chris. Thank you, Josh. Chris, where can people find you online?
Not most places, because I don't exist really online, but you can go to brightrectangle.com, or sometimes I am on Twitter under the Chris Ernst.
Well, I was looking for the Bright Rectangle thing. Where you
brightrectangle.com. That's where you can find me and my stuff.
And you have a couple movies that we've talked about on the show out, and they can find it through that, right?
I do. You can find them on they're on Vimeo and Prime. If you have Amazon Prime Video for free, you can watch them. Corpse and the Hill and the Hole.
Highly recommended. And Josh, people can find you where?
JoshuaCutchin.com, and keep an eye out for Where the Footprints in Volume 2. We should have, we're, knock on wood, absolutely on track for a release before the end of the year. That's as specific as I'll get, but it's coming up soon.
All right. Thank you both.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
I want to take a moment here to give a shout out to all my patrons. All of you help make this show possible. I want to give a special shout out to those of you pledging $10 or more: Frank Earl, Nagatha Christie, Patricia W., Barbara Fisher, Will Powell, Big Boy Limina, Craig Parmenter, Walker, Joanna Rojas, Maddie, Dale Potter, David Moore, Vincent Treewell, The Great Change, Sam Sharon, Stone Wilderness, Luke Osborne, Becky Trainer, Rob Drummond, Alex Whitcomb, Edu Camahort, Tactical Therapist, Janet Bunderson, 36 Dingo, Taylor, Jennifer Campbell, American Rambler, Kevin, Matthew Sproul, John Rutledge Foster, Eric Citron, Andy McNamara, Sasha Jorg, Matthias Sunby, Dominic O'Malley, Christopher Vaughn, Super Inframan, Riker and Stark, Tim, J. Otto Bullitt, Kevin Shrek, Jose A., Roger Gonzalez, Craig Cicernos, Ray Benedetto, Linz Jackson K., Ellison Cook, Alfred Tuttle, James Lattimore, Patricia Giaquinta, William Lovelace, Mark Brady, and Carla Mahoney. Thank you so much for helping make this show possible. All right, we continue this conversation and go in very many different directions on a Patreon-only segment. If you want to become a patron, go to wheredidtheroadgo.com and click on the big Patreon link. It's only $3 a month. You get content, all extra content all month, plus you get the shows ahead of time before they actually get put up publicly. And I'll see you next time. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.